Hello everybody, welcome to Auntie Tsitsi's podcast. Today in the studio we are going to speak to Dumi Gatsha concerning the recent story that was in the newspapers from the 1st of May concerning the United Methodist Church on their decision to include the LGBTQ community in their clergy and also the same-sex marriages. Hello Dumi, welcome to Harare.
Thank you so much, Tsitsi. Hi, greetings to you and your audience.
Okay, may you please introduce yourself further?
Yeah, so my name is Dumi Gatsha. I am pleased to say that I am a Pan-African activist, not only in the context of my work, but also in the context of my identity, being born in Zimbabwe, being a citizen of Botswana, and basically living in South Africa and educated for over a decade. And I think for me what's important is highlighting the need for a more queer, gender and climate just world.
Okay, great to hear that. I'm glad you introduced yourself that way because I was curious about the constitutional amendment to include intersex persons in Botswana. So now that you are here, can you please share what's going on?
So I think maybe just under 2 years ago, Botswana had, or essentially the president of Botswana had appointed a commission of inquiry into the constitution of Botswana. And basically the commission was to canvass the entire country to capture perspectives of Botswana in terms of what they would like to see in a constitutional review. And so fast forward, I think it was a month and a half ago, we had a government gazette that had been issued that included the right to health, the right to work, the right to education, which is all things that we as civil society, Success Capital, my organization, having made a formal submission before the commission. And we were quite pleased with some of these elements, right? But we noted that there were some gaps. But most notably, was the inclusion of intersex persons in this government gazette, which elicited a lot of anti-rights, anti-gender, homophobic, transphobic, particularly coming from the church. And so I think for me, it's not only a reflection of societal beliefs and perceptions, but a reflection that we still have a very long way to go, despite there being progressive constitutional, or let me say judicial judgments that have essentially ensured and safeguarded the rights of LGBTI in Botswana.
Okay. Now that you're speaking of church, recently the United Methodist Church, they had a conference in North Carolina in the United States of America. So they made what is being called a historic decision, where they lifted a ban, a 40-year ban on the clergy, because they never accepted the LGBTQ community. And now they are saying, on this shift, they are saying that the LGBTQ is now included in their churches. They can marry and they can also have LGBTQ plus pastors. So what's your take on that?
I think it isn't the first time. We've seen some UK-based churches make some of those progressive pronouncements. I think some of them started with allowing women to be part of the clergy. And so I think it's really a reflection of not only the times, but also of people getting to understand some of the realities of LGBTIQ individuals. I think what is maybe a little bit of a challenge is obviously their African counterparts don't necessarily share the same beliefs. But we know that there's been a lot of work, you know, emanating from the 2010s and so forth, where people have been trying to educate. And we know because members of the LGBTI community are part of congregations. They're part of the communities because they're Christians and they seek, you know, spiritual refuge. And so I think for me, it's a positive development, and it really then speaks to the need to make sure that there's accommodation and inclusion for everyone, regardless of where you are and what your beliefs are.
Yeah, so there's a lady from Zimbabwe. Her name is Molly Hlekani Mayera. She was one of the lay delegates there at the conferences, and she's the one who was active in proposing the amendment. in the revision of the social principles of their church. And unfortunately, this side of Africa, especially on social media, people are crying for about that. So what do you think should be done to convince people in Africa to embrace that decision? Or
so I think it's not unique, right? I don't think it's unique to Zimbabwe. I don't think it's unique to South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, where we know that there are quite a lot of efforts going around in terms of anti-LGBT legislature. And I guess in our context it's very different because we are finding now the conflation of sexual orientation and gender identity on the issues of sex characteristics. And I think already that speaks to a need for solidarity, that speaks to a need for allyship, that speaks to a need for community. And I think, for us in civil society, we speak about movement building, but I think community is what we need. We need to understand, is it mutual aid? Is it reparative philanthropy that is needed? And these are things that we have to unpack. Acknowledging that our activists need rest, acknowledging that we need to be able to speak to the structural and strategic issues whilst addressing the very tangible needs that we have as community, whether it's underemployment, unemployment, social protections, or the need to care for our family. But I think, I'd like to highlight over that very same date, between the 1st and the 2nd of May in Uganda, there was an African conference on an African Interparliamentary Conference on Family Values and Sovereignty. And I think this is very important for us to acknowledge and recognize, in as much as there are people who then often perpetuate Western beliefs and values, the reality, a lot of those beliefs and values are underpinned by violence. They're underpinned by exclusion, and I don't think this is foreign to colonialism. This is not foreign to the very reality of Western nations dictating what the narrative should be. And they've been successful. Firstly, it's very weird for our own Speaker of Parliament to be attending such a conference, knowing full well our own legislative environment in being very progressive and enabling of LGBTQ individuals, particularly because that's coming from a ruling party. I'm not surprised that Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Comoros, Sudan, South Sudan, were part of that conference. But it also speaks to how a lot of these anti-rights elements, how the religious institutions are now mobilizing in a way that is worrisome. We know that they're already securing a lot of great resources. And I think within the political landscape, my own country going towards elections this year, we know that the marriage between the church and the state is quite strong. And so I think for me, it's really trying to figure out, as a democracy, as a country that is party to the Sustainable Development Goals, that is party to several international human rights systems and instruments, what does that mean, and how are we reflective of all Africans, all Botswana? What does that mean for us if we're sitting there and saying we want to subjugate and basically replicate some of the injustices that were perpetuated during colonial era times?
Okay, so what you suggest that the LGBTIQ plus community should do to defend themselves against this strong movement of the anti-rights?
So I think, Tsitsi, it's really unfortunate because you'd want to be able to respond because you're impacted and affected, right? But I think it's important to acknowledge the power dynamic. Firstly, we know full well that resourcing where provided is very narrow. It's whether it's health resourcing, or it might be looking specifically in terms of whether it's SRHR or HIV programming, and that doesn't necessarily allow us to advocate and ensure that we're countering some of these elements. And also we must acknowledge that a lot of these lashbacks or a lot of these movements can be quite violent. So I think the first thing is to ensure that our community is safe, our community is healthy, our community is fed, because I think our very existence is a form of resistance. Secondly, I think there is a need to figure out where are some of those allies, whether it's in UN agencies, whether it's in governments, because we know there's a certain level of proximity. If it's not the proximity of a taxpayer, it's the proximity of an employee. It's the proximity of a family member. And so how can we leverage whatever power there is amongst us as community members to mobilize and encourage a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more visibility, and a little bit more understanding? Because I think, in looking at our own country's democratic principles, our country is underpinned by dialogue. And so when we're sitting and saying we want a knowledge-based economy, when we're sitting and saying we are an aspiring democracy, what does that mean in realizing some of those very fundamental principles? I mean, we have got a distinct value, a Botswana value, that is called Setho. And it's very similar to Ubuntu, which is universal and distinct to Africa. For me, that is the overarching and underpinning value of Africanism, of Pan-Africanism. And I think for me, that's the starting point. How do you then encourage some of that across all sectors, not just social justice or human rights?
To me, there's something an issue that I wanted to ask concerning health. I've noticed that, I don't know if it happens in Botswana, but here in Zimbabwe, mainly when we speak of health in the community, the main focus is HIV and AIDS and STIs. So I'm confused, because when it comes to intersex persons, we have other health challenges. I believe it's everyone. So I don't know. What do you think should be done?
So I think there are significant gaps. I mean, it's understandable because HIV is really, well funded, and also we know that, a lot of that funding goes towards MSM, men who have sex with men. And so I think for me, it's really also a reflection of the gendered reality of the world that we live in. And so I think it's really about now starting to interrogate what does that mean when we don't have data, when we don't have visibility. For instance, as in Botswana and many other countries where, they don't have some of the same advancements as has been done in, for example, in Kenya, in inclusion of intersex folks in statistical data. And so I think it's also really about interrogating the system, that when we're talking about primary health care, are we ensuring the inclusion of intersex infants in the context of maternal health, in the context of decision making, because we already know that there's a lot of genital mutilation on infants.
Yes, true.
And so I think it's very important to also now, question the pediatric model in terms of the health system. How do we accommodate? How do we ensure that there's enough information for parents, to receive appropriate guidance, for health practitioners to undertake appropriate care? How do we ensure documentation to prevent statelessness, individuals who are not given birth certificates? Because we do have, ethnic minorities, for example, as a result of, traditional practices, who then don't give birth in, public health facilities. And so I think for me, it's, there are multiple strategies that are needed. The first is to ensure that evidence can be built, that we generate the evidence to justify the programming. And I think for me, one human rights violation is enough, to justify the need to accommodate and strengthen primary health care. And I think, there are other elements that we never speak about, for example, with mental health. What does that mean in the context of an environment where there are high levels of violence, where there's unemployment, where efficacy is an issue? Acknowledging, some of those... Can I just come in there? Where
intersex, being born intersex is being labeled as a taboo, especially when it comes to traditionally, actually, because now when somebody is born intersex, for example, in a village, and then they say that it's not going to rain because this child is abnormal, and maybe they are chased away from home, or the mother is divorced, and the child ends up in the street. We actually have intersex persons who are homeless, who grew up in the streets, and it's not healthy for them to be there. Remember, there was a cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe. It also affected them.
So I think, it's important. I mean, in some of the research work that I've done, that was basically looking at the LGBTQ community, we had instances where a traditional leader would even share and say, but we know that they're intersex people. And you find that there are families that feel shame. There are families that don't want to publicly disclose or seek, assistance. And it's usually when a social worker contacts the chief and that's when he's made aware of that instance. But I think you mentioned so many other elements, because I think the assumption is that LGBTIQ issues are always limited to either the health related issues. But I think just from the example when you spoke about houselessness, I mean, for me it's also an issue of food security.
Yes.
It's also an issue of economic participation. What does that mean even for informal traders who are now trying to navigate whether it's bylaws or ensure that they are able to negotiate with other individuals where they don't have an enabling environment. So I think we need to acknowledge and recognize that intersex issues, just as much as queer issues, are impacted by climate. They're impacted by migration. They're impacted by economic exclusion, and that there's a need to ensure that there's structural, social, and policy inclusion.
And the fact that they are not documented, you were talking about the forthcoming elections in your country. They cannot even vote. So their voice is not heard anyway. It's like a person is non-existent. Yeah. So I think, I don't know if you have anything more to contribute, but I think we've touched almost everything that's happening. I know there's more. Yeah.
So I think, maybe it's just to say, there's a need to acknowledge that our community has experienced a lot of trauma. Our community continues to experience trauma. And I think with the many climate, gendered, queer, justice issues that are impacting us, there's a need for us to give us space. Give us the space to breathe, the space to heal, particularly intergenerationally, because we know that the activists who came before us who are still carrying certain burdens and who've done, had certain battles. And I think we haven't allowed us, to learn enough from them and some of their experiences, particularly in the anti-rights movement environment. And I think there's a need for us to really figure out how do we bridge, how do we encourage solidarity, how do we encourage allyship in a way that doesn't take up space, and more importantly, that ensures that our Africanness is not taken away from us.
True. Okay. Thank you so very much, Dumi.
No, thank you.
Yeah. Hope to talk to you again in the future.
We will.
All right. To wrap up on this issue, we leave it to the audience. Please let us know what you think about what's going on in the world, especially the folk from Africa, because from the comments that we are reading on social media, we noticed that many Africans are against that decision, especially the members of the United Methodist Church.